listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you and welcome to The Briefing. A group of teenagers have been arrested over the brutal murder of two young boys in Melbourne in a case that's reignited debates over rising youth and knife crime. So who's telling us the truth and are we handling it the right way?
Penalties are necessary when we're committing crimes. We need to have some sort of limits on what behaviour is acceptable and what behaviour isn't. But I question whether 3 years in a youth justice centre is actually going to meaningfully change behaviour of young people.
That deep dive is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spyrou. It's Monday, the 22nd of September.
Hey Tara, and to you listening. Australia has joined Canada and the United Kingdom in formally recognising Palestine as a sovereign state ahead of a meeting of the UN General Assembly in New York this week. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who are both in New York for the meeting, say it's part of a coordinated international effort towards a two-state solution that must start with a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages.
In a joint statement released last night, they reiterated that the recognition of Palestinian statehood rests on assurances that Israel has a right to exist, the Palestinian Authority holds democratic elections, and that Hamas has no role in the territory. The move means that Australia, Canada and the UK have become part of the more than 150 countries to formally make the move, with 7 other Western countries, including France, Belgium and Portugal, signalling they will do the same this week.
Australians want the killing to stop. This is the best chance the world has had in decades to disarm and isolate Hamas and deliver self-determination for the people of Palestine. This is a moment of opportunity for nations of goodwill to work together.
So practically what this means is that the Australian government will no longer refer to the region as the occupied Palestinian territories in its documents and the way that it speaks about Palestine. So rather, it will refer to it as Palestine or the State of Palestine. And there are longer term plans, Penny Wong has said, to establish embassies. There's no word yet on where those embassies will be located. Now, the important thing here, Tara, is that this doesn't necessarily strengthen our government's powers or influence here, but it's more a show of support. And you know, as we listed all those other countries, when you stack up some of that support is when you get the ball rolling in this space. Now, we have heard from the opposition leader, Susan Lee, and Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Michaelia Cash. In a joint statement, they've described the move as a hollow gesture of false hope to the Palestinian people and a chilling act of concession to Hamas, saying recognition must come at the end of a peace process, not during the conflict.
Yeah, and that's a sentiment also reflected by Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu, who in a video message described it as a huge reward for terrorism, saying it will not happen and that a Palestinian state will not be established.
Overseas now, where a funeral service is underway at a stadium in Arizona.
Charlie Kirk represented a God-fearing American patriot.
To commemorate the life of conservative commentator Charlie Kirk, many attendees lined up for hours, some camping overnight, to be able to attend the funeral service, which had heightened security and no one allowed to bring bags inside.
Yeah, and there's a number of notable guests that are expected to attend and speak at the service today, including President Donald Trump, who has just touched down in Arizona, and the majority of his cabinet. So Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, and US Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And there's also some conservative commentators like Tucker Carlson who are expected to address the crowd as well. Now, some of Charlie's former Turning Point colleagues have already said a few words, so far describing him as a freedom fighter.
Today, I feel like Charlie is challenging us. Will we meet his challenge to fight for freedom, for family, for faith?
My life was forever changed by Charlie. All of us in this room have that in common.
And looking at the footage, Tara, because this is all unfolding as we're recording these headlines, it really looks almost like the MAGA political rallies that you do see in the US, people donning the American colours, people having American signs, T-shirts, posters. And of course, there was a heavily Christian feel to this service with a lot of crosses and scriptures also seen. Before guests arrived, seats of the stadium were lined with posters with Charlie's picture on them. There were biblical scriptures as well as the words Never Surrender placed behind red bracelets reading "We Are Charlie Kirk."
At least 5 people tried to warn telco giant Optus of an outage that impacted 000 calls and is now linked with the deaths of at least 3 customers. According to Optus, the 13-hour outage impacted hundreds, with those who rang 000 during that time getting a deadline, Chris. And among the deaths were 2 men from WA, aged in their 40s and 70s, and a 68-year-old woman from South Australia. There was also a grandmother of a now deceased newborn baby boy that said she'd also tried to dial emergency services when the 8-week-old stopped breathing. However, she was able to successfully ring through on a separate phone.
According to Optus, various operators were notified that 000 wasn't working for some customers. However, their concerns weren't escalated. The public wasn't informed of the outage for over 40 hours. Since then, Optus has also admitted it received an early warning of the failure late last week, saying it was triggered by a firewall upgrade. Optus chief Stephen Rue says the telco will now implement a mandatory escalation process and apologise to the families impacted.
I would like to reiterate how sorry I am about the very sad loss of the lives who could not reach emergency services in their time of need.
Federal and state governments have slammed the telco giant, with the Communication Authority now investigating the incident.
Ex-PM Tony Abbott, now Liberal backbencher Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, Pauline Hanson and a British PM whose tenure was outlasted by a lettuce were among the headliners of a 2-day Conservative political conference in Brisbane over the weekend. The Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, got underway on Saturday with one of the main attractions, Senator Nampijinpa Price, who was introduced to the crowd as, quote, the woman who saved Australia from the divisive voice to Parliament referendum whilst draped in an Australian flag.
In her speech, she said it was tough to be a supporter of Conservative politics, and while acknowledging her last few weeks were tough, obviously getting dumped from the front bench over those comments about Indian migration, she says it doesn't compare to the suffering of Israeli hostages in Gaza or the pain of Charlie Kirk's family, the activist that she did pay tribute to.
Around the world, there have been many moments of silence for Charlie Kirk, and rightly so. But I want something different today. Friends, please be upstanding. Let me hear you clap, let me hear you cheer, and let me hear you roar for Charlie and for freedom of speech.
She also called for her colleagues to dump net zero targets, which National Senator Matt Canavan also echoed, telling the conference the opposition was on the cusp of walking away from them.
Yeah, and we also heard from Tony Abbott, who blamed the coalition's election defeat on a failure to campaign their pro-nuclear policy, Chris, and he called for reform within the Liberal Party and for lower migration and stronger cultural integration. Now, that last point was also one that was supported by Liz Truss, who was that Prime Minister of the UK for just 45 days back in 2022. And we mentioned lettuce up above. Some of you might recall the joke that a lettuce would outlast her time as PM, which it did. And anyway, she had this to say at the conference.
Some of the things I hear people talking about here in Australia, I think in Britain, it's got even worse. So our energy prices are sky high. We've got a problem with Islamism, grooming gangs, crime. We've got a huge problem with immigration, and we need to fight.
Also among the crowd was One Nation's Pauline Hanson, where she decided to reveal some massive news, and that, Tara, was that she'll be releasing the movie-length film of her Please Explain cartoon series, which will debut on January 26 next year, or as she put it, quote, the most important day of the year in January, Australia Day.
Okay, well, no major surprises just there. Yeah. Now, we also saw Gina Reinhardt was among the crowd, the important point being that she is a political donor, one of several who did attend this conference. And look, I think it is important to stay across what's going on all sides of the political spectrum, because as we saw in the polls, Chris, where the Liberals have been losing numbers, a lot of that has been going to One Nation. And while we have seen there's been this kind of flow of women voters toward the left, at the same time, we're also seeing young men becoming more conservative. So the people attending this conference are the people leading the charge.
And it turns out plenty of Aussies are willing to risk a fine when catching public transport.
Oh.
With Sydney, that's right, my home city, recording the highest fare evasion rates in the whole country.
Naughty.
Well done, Sydneysiders. Ticket prices are also about 20% more expensive than 6 years ago in my little hometown, Tara.
Yeah, and apparently we're not all as badly behaved as you Sydney folk, Chris. In Melbourne, there's about 50% less fare dodging, according to The Guardian, while in good old Queensland, it has fallen dramatically since the introduction of 50-cent fares. And I mean, what does that tell you other than people clearly want cheaper transport and giving it to them seems to work? Like, we have seen a massive uptick in people using public transport here since that 50-cent fare was brought in, and better for the environment too, like win-win-win. And I mean, what about you, Chris? Like, how much does it cost you when you're taking the bus or the train into work?
Oh, look, as a train catcher, let me tell you, it sits around, it's $5 per way. So if I'm going and coming back, it's $10 a day. So what's that, $50 a week?
Yeah, see, that's a rort.
It is.
That's
Oh
a
my God, I'm
rort.
so glad you said that. It really is a rort. And the mentality among fare evaders, because I have sat with a few, is that while we're sitting there paying $50 a week, they cop a fine once a year, once every 2 years, and they're like, it's only $200. So really, it's a win-win, which, is logic that I can't argue with this morning, Tara.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm not going to say I'm promoting anything here, but we'd love to know what you guys think, our listeners. We're going to pop a question about this in our broadcast channel Behind the Briefing on Instagram. Let us know your thoughts on this one. Now, that brings our headlines to a close for today. Coming up next is your deep dive, Chris, on the rise of youth and knife crime in Victoria, what the numbers tell us and whether we're taking the right approach. Have a listen to that up next.
The brutal and fatal stabbings of two young boys on their way home from a basketball game in Melbourne's west this month, one 15 and the other 12, made national headlines.
It is one of the most horrific crimes in a substantial and growing list of crimes of this nature. We have yet to really crack that nut open that explains why young male offenders behaving in such a violent and extreme manner.
And while police last Friday arrested 7 people aged between 15 and 19, believed to have ambushed the boys with machetes and other blades, it's a horrific crime that sparked big questions around youth offending in Victoria. So what's going on in the state at the moment? How did we get here? And are the solutions being served up by the government helping or hindering? Dr Brianna Chesser is a criminal lawyer, registered clinical forensic psychologist and associate professor in criminology at RMIT. Brianna, welcome to the briefing. The whole country would have heard about the fatal stabbings of 12-year-old Chola Chek and 15-year-old Dale Quinn. It seems shocking that something like this could happen in Australia, but it appears to be a part of a wider trend. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, look, in Victoria, we've had a significant increase over really the last 30 years, pretty much since we started recording statistics of this upward trend in youth crime. I've got some stats here for you, Chris, and offences committed between 10-year-olds and 17-year-olds have increased by 16% in the last year alone in Victoria.
How did we get here, though?
Look, looking at those statistics, it obviously is quite alarming. We're seeing it a lot more in the news in Victoria. There are lots of things happening with young people that might account for this. The most obvious answer, I think, for us is that young people are simply committing more crimes. They are out in public more. They're not supervised as much as what they would have been. They're perhaps not attending school. They're not as engaged as what they used to be. And there are a multitude of reasons for that. What we know, however, is that some youths are choosing to commit offences. And in fact, if we think about those statistics, what we've found in Victoria, that most of the offences are being committed by the same 300 young people.
So that seems to be really an issue with repeat offending. Where is the justice system in the state kind of going wrong or missing a step here?
Well, look, I think it's definitely on the agenda of the Victorian Parliament. So you may have heard about some changes to our bail laws, particularly our youth bail laws, which make reoffending whilst on bail an offence in and of itself. Now, many of my academic colleagues have had quite a lot to say about whether or not incarceration is a solution. I certainly agree with their arguments. Their arguments contain concerns about increasing the likelihood of youths returning out of a youth justice centre committing more serious crimes. They're worried about disengagement. They're worried about young people coming from disadvantaged and marginalised backgrounds not having access to things that might engage them in life. The fact of the matter is, for us here in Victoria, youth crime is definitely on the rise, and members of the population, the community, they're frightened. They don't feel safe in their own homes. They don't feel safe in their cars. And I think that's why the Victorian government is really trying to modify the bail laws to deal with that group of repeat offenders. But also, you may have heard that we've now got a machete amnesty here in Victoria that started in early September and is going to run through until November, where members of the public, if they do have machetes, can just pop them in a machete bin. And then when machetes become illegal later on this year and early into next year, they won't be in possession of what will be deemed a dangerous weapon in Victoria.
And you've previously spoken about the effectiveness of a machete ban like this, or a ban like this on weapons. Do you think this is the right move by the Victorian government?
I think while it is a step in the right direction, I do remain sceptical about who actually is handing in these machetes. I think it's probably just good citizens who happen to have one in their shed who want to abide by the law. If you think we've had around 1,300 machetes surrendered by members of the public, 3,500 came from retailers, we would probably expect those numbers to be a little bit higher. And I do wonder about how influential it's going to be for the people committing crimes with machetes, that they may well get another crime added to their record or list of charges if they do happen to get arrested in possession of a machete. I do wonder about that, Chris.
This rise in knife crime, especially among young people, has been framed by the media and by certain politicians as a Victorian-specific issue. In your opinion, do you think that's true or fair and accurate?
I do think there's been a lot more reporting of this particular issue in Victoria over the last 5 years. I would even say probably post-COVID, we've had this sort of, general trend upwards. I would, however, say that this is not just limited to Victoria or indeed Australia, that this is a trend that we're seeing internationally across at least Western civilizations. And I think the statistics do really speak for themselves in Victoria. So we definitely have a problem with this in Victoria, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it's an exclusively Victorian problem.
In your opinion, or from how you've understood it, why is there a rise in knife crime specifically?
Well, I think part of the issue was the ease of accessibility with that particular group of weapons. It may be a little bit more difficult to get a firearm, for example, but you would have been able to walk into any Kmart, Target, Harris, Scarf, even Bunnings, and got hold of quite a dangerous weapon. And I think that's why the Victorian government really thought that bringing this machete ban was going to be a step in the right direction, and it is. But I would like to see that happen alongside some other legislative change, some community education, and actually some engagement programs for youth to be able to target the root cause of their dissatisfaction, of their disengagement, rather than just focusing on the symptom, which of course is the crime.
And look, the Allen government, as part of the machete bin rollout, says that there is an adjoining education campaign and community efforts that are a part of that. So time will tell what that looks like. I do want to know, the father of one of the young victims stabbed in Melbourne spoke at the time saying his son wasn't a criminal and that his community is hurting from these crimes.
I'm talking in front of the camera right now on behalf of my community. This is happening to us. We buried this month 4 kids. Similar incident happening. When we ask for answer, what killing our kids? Where's my son? You don't get answer.
Can you unpack his response for us a little bit?
Well, I think there's certainly been this perception portrayed through the media and indeed sort of proliferated through the community that it's particular demographics, particular areas within Victoria that these crimes are happening. And I think we really need to balance our perspective on that and not view this as a crime that targets particular cultural groups or ethnicities. I think what that father was saying was that we really need to be open-minded and quite generous in our approach to how and why these particular crimes are happening. And I think it's quite unfair to target specific cultural groups or specific areas within the Victorian jurisdiction.
When we talk about supporting young offenders, there's this idea that these are a vulnerable group of society who require further supports. What are some of the further supports that you think are worthwhile investing in as a government to kind of nip this issue in the bud, or just to have some progress in this space?
Well, look, I feel really quite strongly about mental health and indeed mental health of young people. And I really think that if we have systems in place, not only within schools, but within community groups, even religious organisations, really targeting where the youth are, that will be providing ground root support for youth to be able to identify what's happening with them. I mean, what we know is that youth who are connected in pro-social activities, who are connected to their community, who have been able to work through issues with their family, are not the ones that are out there committing crimes by and large. It is on the Victorian government's agenda. We have had a number of youth mental health centres pop up over the past few years, but I think we need to be really careful that we're targeting the right groups here. These are not going to be the students at school who are putting their hand up to see the school counsellor saying, I need help. These are going to be the students that maybe don't even attend school, who haven't been to school for many, many years. So I think we really need to be targeting our approach at re-engaging those young people and, giving them an opportunity to be able to contribute to society in a meaningful and pro-social way.
There have been calls from members of the community who listen to that and listen to this idea of wraparound support, and they just think that doesn't cut it. A strong sentiment online and certain parts of the online sphere are calling for the Victorian government to follow in Queensland's footsteps and to adopt an adult crime, adult time model in the state. What do you make of those calls?
Yeah, look, I can see why that might be an attractive option for some members of the public. I mean, they're frightened. Offences are being committed in particular areas in Victoria daily, let alone weekly and monthly. But I think time's really going to tell with the Queensland approach. Adult crime, adult time is all well and good in terms of the impact of the crime, but we also have to consider that what we're dealing with here are not adult brains. These are not fully developed brains. They don't have the capacity to think or reason in the same way that an adult would, and that is simply a biological factor. So I would really exercise caution about really having adult penalties for young people and children committing offences, because biologically their brains simply aren't at the same stage as what an adult brain would be. And the last thing to grow in a human brain, as we know, is our ability to reason, to understand consequences and to foreshadow consequences. And for some of these young people, we're thinking about, ages really between 10 and 17, they're a long way from developing that part of their brain.
For those young offenders, though, who you could arguably look at their situations objectively and think to yourself, well, these are people who can reason, are capable of reasoning, have had an upbringing that lends them towards being able to reason and know that they're doing the wrong thing. Do you think a softer approach for them is still the right thing here, or do you think tougher penalties should apply in situations like that?
Not really a fan of this soft or tough on crime language. I don't think it adds anything to the discourse. I think any sort of penalty for a young person is tough. If we're talking about what they need in terms of their development, what we understand that they need in terms of their development, any sort of penalty is going to be impacting that in some way. And I really think that we ought not to take that lightly. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that there ought to be no penalty for young people. I really think that it's our duty as adults within this community to be able to model pro-social behaviour, to be able to provide the supports, to be able to assist young people. I really would like to see, to be honest, an entire overhaul of the youth justice system. I know that's a big call, but I think penalties are necessary. When we're committing crimes, we need to have some sort of limits on what behaviour is acceptable and what behaviour isn't. But I question whether 3 years in a youth justice centre is actually going to meaningfully change behaviour of young people, or whether there's some sort of alternative that might be better. We're at the beginning of this process, but I agree we need change. I agree we need penalties. But I think we have to balance that with the fact that, these brains aren't grown. The children exist within the circumstances of their environment that we can't change without external intervention. And I really would like some roundtables and things to be able to work out what is the best way forward. We know it's not working, so let's try and find something that will.
Dr Brianna Chesser, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks, Chris.
That was criminal lawyer and forensic psychologist Dr Brianna Chesser speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.